To order this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. First item on the agenda is citizen comment. Any citizen wishing to render comment, please step forward to the podium, state your name, your address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. And let me point out, we're going to have a public hearing tonight, so the citizen comment portion is for only comments not relating to the subject of the public hearing, and the subject is microhousing apartment code amendments. So if you want to render comment on that, let's pass on the citizen comment. We'll wait till we hold the public hearing. But if you want to comment on anything else relating to city matters, please step forward and be heard.
Can I ask a question?
You may.
Is that parking in general not specific about the micro-housing? So,
That's suited for citizen comment at this point, yeah.
okay, so I'll put it in the citizen comment.
This is it.
All right.
Come on up. Hey, Mike.
He'll say his own name. He signed up.
Name, address, and go.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Todd Prince, 6706 Northeast 185th Street in Kenmore. And so first, thank you for the time, for the work you do, and allowing me to speak. I hope what I share relates to some of what you're talking about, and it's appropriate for you and not the general counsel. And while I appreciate the benefits of denser housing, micro-housing, and all the benefits that come with it, such as transportation options, parking is of concern. With limited residential parking, the overflow goes to the street parking, or can be an issue for other property owners in overflow parking for guests, potential increase in crime. With parking on the street vehicles left for days, weeks, or even months, can make an easy mark for break-ins, and this can also then spread to other areas. One thing I'm probably bending the line, I did notice in your notes that you identified parking examples for Redmond and Kirkland, but what I didn't see was dedicated parking enforcement, which I think they have. And so I'd be interested to see if you did how you go forward, how you maybe address dedicated parking with parking enforcement. I have a duplex on Northeast 185th Street. It's a residential street, and I'm really the only resident for about a 2-block between 68th Avenue and 66th Avenue. I take pride in the neighborhood and try to do what I can to help clean up. I'll pick up litter and clean the storm drains. Several years ago, when I moved into the area, there was an abundance of abandoned vehicles left on Northeast 185th Street, vehicles left for weeks and even months, as well as commercial vehicles. During that time, I saw break-ins, and I even reported some myself because the vehicle owner was not attending to their vehicle. I didn't want this to become a place for car break-ins and then have that spread to my property, and as I mentioned, it's a duplex, so I have tenants, and I don't want that to become an issue where I can't hold a tenant. So over time, was able to clean this up, and with the help of the police and constantly reporting vehicles, became less of an issue. So aside from the auction parking, which is about every 6 weeks, and that's limited, I understand that, the parking along the street there became much less frequent. In the past year, with the park and ride going away and new apartments coming in and the condominiums having to look at parking, I've seen an increase with the abandoned vehicles in this area. It's returned to even greater than when I moved in. It appears with the limited parking for the residents and apartment condominiums, they're now leaving their vehicles on the street parking to use that as permanent parking. So with the street parking now becoming permanent, I'm calling what appears to be several times a month now regarding abandoned vehicles and even commercial vehicles. As I mentioned, I try to take pride in the neighborhood, and I'll pick up garbage. And in the past year, this has increased dramatically. Not a big thing. I'm picking up coffee cups and such. Don't mind that. But what is concerned is I'm seeing alcoholic beverages being left on the side, being discarded, as well as having seen some marijuana packages. As recently as October 31st, I was cleaning storm drains, and kids are walking up the sidewalk, no big thing, except I walk by a vehicle and there's people inside smoking marijuana. And so that's a concern. This is middle of the day and there's kids walking by. whether it be marijuana, alcohol, or something like that. I just don't see that's an appropriate place. And that's, as I've seen more and more abandoned vehicles and vehicles just being left there, that's increasing. So these were not issues a year ago. And my concern is where we're going to be in another year or in 2 years if something isn't done. As a property owner, I feel it's my responsibility to provide parking for my residents. Street parking, if available, seems like it should be temporary. So my hope is that we can do more proactive than potentially reactive action. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
for your
Todd.
time.
Anybody else? Okay. Thank you, Todd. That satisfies that element of the agenda. The next item on the agenda is approval of the November 17, 2015 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Do I hear a second? Commissioner Ordenschall seconds. Do I hear discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. The minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda is the public hearing for microhousing apartment code amendments. I hereby invite the staff to the presentation table, taking my cue from their rising.
Okay.
Yes.
Good evening. So tonight is the public hearing on the proposed microhousing apartment code amendments. As you know, microhousing apartments are smaller than typical residential units that may contain their own kitchen and bath facilities, but may also be clustered around a central kitchen or bath set of bath facilities. The current interest in microhousing is generated both by a desire to downsize, reduce environmental footprint, but also to have reduced housing costs, even though these small apartments may cost more to initially build. Because they're so small, the rents are typically lower than even for a traditional studio apartment. The amendments before you tonight do just a few things. They define microhousing and clarify that microhousing apartment projects are treated like other multifamily developments. There's a lack of clarity in the current zoning code, and this clearly outlines that a microhousing apartment unit is an apartment, whether it has kitchen facilities or bath facilities in it or not. And then it subjects those microhousing apartments to the same standards for density and location and design as any other apartment project. The microhousing apartment definition states that a unit can be no smaller than 220 square feet, which is the building code minimum. And so 220 square feet of habitable space. That doesn't include the bathroom or a closet, for example. And at the upper end, it's limited to less than 320 square feet, because at 320 square feet, you could have more than 2 occupants. And there was a concern expressed by the Planning Commission early on that you did not want this to be a situation where you would have a very small unit with a number of people living in it. So the one development standard proposed for adjustment is parking. And the proposed regulations retain the existing studio apartment parking rate for those microhousing apartment units that are more than a quarter mile from SR 522. So they just mimic those existing ratios. However, within a quarter mile of 522, the recommendation is that the parking ratio be reduced to 0.6 stalls per unit. And that is equivalent to what is currently being required in the city's transit-oriented development district. And the number is reduced to acknowledge that SR 522 is a transit corridor. I provided some background information in your packet about parking and parking ratios. I don't have parking studies from projects other than those that I referenced in Kirkland and Redmond. Certainly, City of Seattle has seen a lot of microhousing apartment units, but there is no parking requirement. So there is no corollary parking study that is helpful in this regard. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, or you may wish to hold your questions until after the public hearing. Your choice.
Anybody want to ask any questions now? Okay, so we'll hold them until after the hearing.
Well,
Yes, please.
I have one follow-up question. So the city of Seattle has no parking regulations when it comes to micro-housing, specifically just micro-housing?
It has to do with where the microhousing is being located, and in those areas where it is being located, because those are in transit-oriented areas, if you're within a certain distance of transit, you do not have to provide parking in your, and that's no different for microhousing than for any other apartment unit. That's just sort of a City of Seattle rule about they do not want to build parking. They think it's unnecessary.
Okay, thanks.
So.
So following up on that, so the
Yeah.
ratio is 0 per unit
Correct.
in Seattle? Wow. Okay.
They assume that they leave it up to the market. They assume that whoever is building the units is going to acknowledge where they're located and whether they need to provide units or not for their future residents.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? No? So, thank you. All right. So with that background, we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the public hearing for microhousing apartment code amendments. And when wishing to step forward and render public hearing comment on that subject, please step forward to the podium, state your name, your address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes.
Mark Prince, 19330 55th Avenue Northeast, Kenmore. I am concerned still about the parking. Seattle's great for very dense parking, or lack of it, because in a small, dense area, they have things to do. They have entertainment, they have restaurants. Kenmore doesn't have a lot of that. So you're still relying on people to transport into other areas. I go to Woodinville, in certain areas of Woodinville or Bellevue. Transit isn't the best option for me on certain times. I have to drive. Those people will probably have to drive. Where are they going to park? So that's my big concern is still, it's great to have the high density, but we also need the infrastructure to support that. So we have to have everything in place so people don't have to travel. We don't have that quite yet. Hopefully we will. Thank you.
Yeah. Is it Mike? Was it Mike Prince? Mark Prince. Thank you, Mark. All right. I think that's everybody, but I think Todd's already rendered his comment, so I think we've satisfied the public hearing element of the agenda. And this brings the public hearing to a close. So, commissioners, any other questions or comments on the subject of the public hearing? Commissioner Orenshaw?
Several. So bear with me if the first one was a question. Are there any exemptions or waivers for this parking requirement for a developer? Can a developer request?
I think there are some waivers in the zoning code, not specifically related to microhousing, certainly, but in the parking chapter itself. And I can't off the top of my head tell you exactly what those waivers are, but I think there are some additional waivers. With the transit-oriented development district, there are a number of parking alterations, but those would not apply to microhousing apartments unless microhousing apartments were built in the TOD. And if that were the case, then there would be waivers for different things, saving tree groves. I think there are some waivers for providing, I can't think what the other one is. I think at a certain density, you may be able to reduce your parking. So yes, the bottom line is yes, there are options both for non-transit-oriented development projects and transit-oriented development projects to adjust parking.
Downward.
Yes, correct.
Upward, developers can do whatever they want, presumably.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying in Seattle? Developers, it's up to them whether they choose to provide parking?
Yeah,
So it's sort of a market decision?
correct.
Any idea how much the market is responding to that, or developers are doing it? I think there's been pushback in Seattle to off-street parking as
Right. I don't have those numbers. I don't have those numbers.
So the second question I had, could microhousing be part of a traditional multifamily development? In other words, could there be like 2 floors devoted to microhousing and 3 to whatever? And if so, how would the parking and other regulations apply in that case to microhousing?
Right. So it depends on all of the parking ratios for multifamily are related to the size of the unit. So if you were looking at a project, you would determine how many of each type of unit you had. So studio apartments or 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom units, and then you would divvy that out and do your calculations to determine how much parking would be required. And microhousing would just be one other aspect to that analysis.
So it would all be kind of lumped together and then based
Right,
on the total?
you'd calculate it per unit and then you'd have a total.
Right, okay. And also, how does the guest parking and disabled parking work with this?
So disabled parking is actually handled through the building code, and there's beyond a certain number of units, you have to provide some disabled stalls. The guest parking ratio is 1.5 stalls per unit and would not be adjusted for any type of, no, it's 1 space for every 5. I'm sorry, what am I saying? 1.5 per unit. No, it's 1 per 5.
5, okay. And the 0.6 is like first come, first serve, if that's the number?
It would totally depend on how the operator of the building wished to handle it. It could be first come, first serve. It could be assigned if a person needed a parking stall or wanted to pay for a parking stall. The city is not involved in that.
Right. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Orenshaw, anybody else?
I had the same set of questions,
Okay.
basically. So
Great.
Yeah.
Commissioner, I think Mike had his hand up first, and then I'll call you Carol.
Is there a designation in the code for senior living communities? Not necessarily adult care, but
Assisted,
No.
like a graduated kind of a congregate living arrangement?
not necessarily, but residences that are, or apartments that are designated as senior living, so 55 years and above, where you might see a lower car ownership percentage. And if so, do we already have a differentiation on parking stall requirements in that case?
There
And
is-
with the aging of the population, might we see a trend towards more senior living and a reduction in the number of expected parking spaces for that reason?
So in the TOD, for seniors, there is a parking reduction. In the standard parking requirements, I think there's a section that talks about, I need my code in front of me, I'm not ready for all these parking questions. I think there is a section that talks about senior parking, and you can always talk about adjusting your parking ratios if you do a parking study that shows that your type of use does not need the parking. So I would say, yes, there's definitely some language in the zoning code that acknowledges that senior projects may not need as much parking. At the opposite end of the spectrum, has tended to be the same argument for the millennials who might live in a microhousing apartment unit, that they are not as likely to have a car. And I gave some background on that. There has been a lot of literature in the last few years about the lack of interest in car ownership, or a reduced interest in car ownership for millennials. They're driving later. They don't necessarily want a car. They use a lot of alternative solutions, Car2Go, Lyft, a number of other opportunities that don't require a person to own a car to get someplace. But just in the last 6 months, I've read an article that said, oh, well, now that the economy is recovering, maybe these kids are going to buy a car. So I don't know. I'm giving you the best I can. I think these units likely would be millennials or single individuals living in them. And we've talked about, or at the last time we discussed this, there was some question about whether 0.6 was the appropriate ratio. The literature I've read has said don't go over 1 because you'll really discourage this housing type, and it is a desirable, affordable housing type for millennials. So that's what I can offer.
Anything else, Mike?
Yeah, did I read correctly in the analysis of Redmond and Kirkland that their micro-housing parking ratio was 0.5?
Right. Kirkland's certainly was 0.5. And I'm not sure that I had included Redmond's, but I know Kirkland's is 0.5.
I was wondering, by choosing 0.6, if we were really just following the TOD, or are we making a policy statement either encouraging or discouraging the development of micro-housing in selecting 0.6?
The 0.6 was chosen to reflect the TOD. Okay. And that's why it was only chosen in an area that's close to SR 522. It wasn't, there was no other reason for that. Just a desire not to overbuild the parking, but
from that policy perspective, do we know if we should be making a policy statement? In other words, if we care about tax revenue to the city, is micro-housing advantageous or disadvantageous to the tax base? If a developer had the opportunity to build traditional 1- and 2-bedroom apartments, Spencer 168, for example, versus something that had twice the occupancy in the same footprint,
I don't know.
Okay.
I can't answer that question. I mean, maybe sales tax, you'd have more people, so maybe you have more consumers. But that's...
Okay.
Thank you. Carol?
You probably answered this the first time in the summer when we talked a little bit about microhousing, but isn't it advantageous for the city to open up this type of development because it also encourages our ability to link with transportation, what did you call it, oriented districts? As a city, doesn't it make us more desirable to link with the DOT and the transit and the potential little ferry or whatever the regional transportation solutions might be to have some higher density? Isn't that part of our motivation?
So the transit-oriented development district that the City Council adopted this year definitely was focused on that.
Okay.
And our role in the region and the potential for future high-capacity transit along SR 522 or the ferry or that kind of thing. So
Okay.
that certainly was the push
Okay.
for the transit-oriented development district.
Okay.
And microhousing could fit into that. Microhousing was addressed not to encourage this type of housing per se, but just to define it, because the city doesn't really have a good definition of it at this point, and we had received inquiries about microhousing projects, and we felt it was important to put some sort of an envelope around it. So it was not, we did not go into this trying to create incentives for microhousing, and that's why there's no increased density allowed for microhousing, no changes in design standards, nothing like that. And the parking change did not really come around as an incentive, but more as an acknowledgement of the fact that really the parking needs for this type of housing may not be as high as other types of housing. These are very small units, and so keeping the ratio for those developments beyond a quarter mile of SR 522 at the studio apartment ratio may be overkill, but at least since it was closer to transit, we felt more comfortable saying, okay, we'll acknowledge that this could be, given the people who might be living here, who might not be as dependent on a car, who might be oriented to transit, we'll reduce the amount to match the transit-oriented district requirements.
So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to put some recommendations in place so that the council can pass definitions and add those to the amendments that are already in place, probably from previous ordinances, development standards, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But because we're doing a public hearing, I think it's good to review that, even though we have such a large public offering here. But it probably helps to be able to open that conversation. Who knows who's listening to us?
Right.
Or we'll come back and look at it. And so I think it's important for us to remember that the city is trying to do the very best to stay ahead of the trends, put things in place so we have some definitions there, but also be able to be flexible in a future situation where we might have, I was looking at the Seattle history over the last year, and I did find quite a few neighborhood groups that took developers to the courts because they had made the decision not to provide any kind of parking on site. There was only one micro-housing case that was around that, but it clearly does put older neighborhoods, which were in change, in a place of having to address that flexibleness of what happens when more cars come into your neighborhood. How do you handle that? And I think our city is trying to accommodate growth, but we're very aware that we're going to have to accommodate some negative aspects of growth, including micro-housing. But it's good to know that we're addressing it, defining it, wanting to make that available if property owners and developers have some kind of a deal in the work. The city needs to have that defined.
Thank you, Carol. Anybody from over here? There you go. Please, Deborah.
I just want to say I don't think it's necessarily a negative to have microhousing. I mean, it's an option.
It's an option.
I thought that's what I heard you say. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
Well, not everybody's going to think that though, because we're an inclusive neighborhood, community.
So, and I think one of the things, I think Todd and Mark, brought up exactly the rub, which is, are you creating these units and then people say, oh, I won't need a car, then get a car, then park it on the street. And so I don't know if now is the moment to let us know what the parking enforcement looks like, or whether that would be adjusted, or, because I know exactly what he's talking about. I pass by there every day. And my daughter's complaining about the same thing. She can't see the stop sign. The cars are parked there. I mean, it's problematic, and it's just one spot. So I'm guessing there's other places that are similarly not enforced.
So it's definitely an enforcement issue. So it's a police matter. So they enforce parking.
Okay.
Whether it's blocking a driveway, that kind of a thing,
right,
or abandoned vehicles if it's been
okay,
parked on the street too long. So that's addressed by the police. So if a concern or a complaint comes in, it's usually directed to the police department because they're the ones that are responsible for enforcement.
This sounds like it means Todd's doing his best to, repeatedly get on this, and I don't know whether there's some way that this potentially could be exacerbated by additional density in the downtown core.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether that could be flagged as something the city could take up with the police.
Well, parking in the downtown is probably something that's a topic that may come up in a broader sense as downtown develops, and that as on-street parking then becomes more attractive to a variety of users, because that's what's available. So then the question comes in: how do you address that if it becomes an issue to the neighborhoods? Do you strike more no parking, or do you have limited parking, or how do you address that? So we know that that's going to be a broader topic that comes up for how we address on-street parking, because right now we don't have metered parking. We don't, so we know that we'll have to take a look at that, and we've the city's sort of taken a look at how we can improve on-street parking or provide more on-street parking in the downtown, whether it's along 68 even. So we're trying to sort of balance the what we do with on-street parking, how we provide more on-street parking, recognizing that there might be an enforcement component to that. So we know it's there, and we know that we've heard some complaints or concerns come in, and we're trying to address those. But long term, we may have to look more closely at how we address parking in the downtown. So I guess it's a broader topic that we'll have to address for the downtown.
Okay, anybody else? No?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I also wanted to just touch on the fact that when it comes to like micro housing as a concept, I think it does support the comprehensive plan and what we've talked about, the goal of having housing available at all levels and being that inclusive city. And it also helps with, I think, increased demand and accessibility, hopefully for future transit and more transit. And I think would also really help contribute to that vision of a more walkable area, especially if they're in high density areas like our downtown or near the waterfront. On the other hand, I am really worried about parking, because I do feel like already in the downtown area, it seems like there isn't enough parking for some of the local businesses, especially like if you park near any of those breweries now that are open along that road. Like it's pretty packed in the evenings, and while it's possible that the micro housing units, that the people living in them may not all own cars, I do think that in general, like, I don't think there are very many cities that have an overabundance of parking. Like, if anything, it's probably going to go the opposite trend, that as we become more dense, as there becomes a more, a town green and more attractive shopping and attractions in our downtown core, that parking is just going to get worse. So I guess I'm leaning more towards maybe having more parking requirement for this so that it doesn't exacerbate the problem down the road than less.
Okay. Anybody else? Mark and then Deborah. Does that sound right?
Oh.
I saw a couple of hands go up at the same time, but I'll let you decide.
Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I think Angela hit some very good points there on the benefits, and I think Mr. Prince, hit some very good points on the effects there. So I guess one of my questions is to go from 0.6 to the standard 1 per unit. That's almost double the number of required units. How big of a lift is that for a developer in terms of cost, in terms of their decision to, pursue a micro-housing development? Do we have any? I think I might have asked that question before.
Right.
It sounds like there may not be, a blanket answer, but trying to get a better idea of how that affects not just the marketability, but the bringing people in to do that if, they see a market here.
Yeah. What I can tell you is that I've seen numbers varying from $20,000 to $50,000 added to the cost per stall.
For one stall?
For one stall. So if you look at it that way, then almost doubling the number of stalls is a significant issue, and I think that that's why the references that I cited all said, don't go over one, because it won't pencil out if you go over one. I want to reassure you that, at least from my perspective, if the commission is more comfortable with 1 rather than 0.6, I don't have a concern about that. We don't have good hard data, but I certainly would not go over. Good hard data from Kenmore. We just don't have it. I would hesitate to go over 1 for sure. So if you wanted to stick with the original studio apartment ratio, or just have it 1 within the distance of SR 522, I understand that, and there is just not a lot of hard information that I can bring to you that I have not already brought to you about it.
Anything else, Mark? Okay, Deborah?
So, and
Just as a point of clarification, so in the TOD, in the Transit-Oriented Development District, if these were built, they would still be 0.6, correct?
They would.
Yeah, they would have to be. Okay.
But
So
the
if
TOD
we
is in
go-
a more limited area than all multifamily zones, which is where these could
Correct.
be built.
Correct. I understand that. However, if we move the needle to 1 or even above 0.6, we would essentially discourage we would eliminate the ability for these to occur in the TOD.
No, it actually would be the opposite. So
Okay.
that if you made it 1 for a microhousing apartment, once you agree to do a TOD, all your standards change. You flip from the regular zoning into the TOD zoning. And the TOD zoning has different standards. You can go up to 150 dwelling units per acre. It's a huge density opportunity. Your parking ratio goes down.
Right. The parking ratio goes down.
So it's an incentive still to do TOD in the TOD area.
Okay, but the effective parking ratio in the TOD would be 0.6.
Correct.
Yeah, so, okay. All right, I see what you're saying. I mean, the density bonus essentially by building in the TOD kind of overshadows the
Well,
issue
you'd have
of the
reduced parking. You would
Right.
have reduced parking requirements because if you built your microhousing apartment outside of the TOD, you'd have to do it at 1, if that was what the zoning code said.
Right.
If you did your microhousing inside of the TOD, you would do it at 0.6.
Right. Right. Understood. We could also split the difference. I mean, I think the thing with microhousing is we do have some evidence to suggest that people who want microhousing are less likely to have and want a car that they own. The question is, how much less likely? So, are they half as likely? Are they 0.6? Are they 0.8? So I personally would hope that we wouldn't have to go to 1, but I also see the discomfort at the 0.6. So.
Okay, and I think these are really good points, and they kind of dovetail with what Mark and Todd were bringing up. And the point that Mark made was this concept seems much more suited to a highly dense and locally full service area like Seattle, especially because they have metered parking and they have strict parking limits on how long you can park. You have to get a permit in a lot of these urban neighborhoods. We have none of that, I think. So it's certainly not an apples to apples, but on the other hand, they're at 0. So that's a big gap even with 0.6. And then the data we have is from Kirkland and Redmond, and they have 0.5. But they, too, I think, have much stricter parking rules and metered parking in various places and much more full service for the people who live in those areas. So that's not an apples-to-apples comparison with Kenmore. And I think there's, as Angela pointed out, and I think as Deborah's pointing out, there's a much greater risk that we'll have overflow parking that's taking advantage of the low burden, the low cost we put on public parking in Kenmore without having a lot of there's no structured parking, there's no structured public parking, and there's no pay lots that I know of. We don't have the parking capacity. So there's a much greater incentive for inconvenient parking or loitering or that kind of thing that the princes have brought it up. So I do think that something better than 0.6 is suitable for this, and we ought to err on the side of caution, which is make them do some more parking. On the other hand, and Deborah, what you brought up was, and what Lori said in response, I didn't quite follow, this flip into the TOD with all its benefits. My understanding is microhousing has the same density standards as, there's no improvement in density standards for microhousing.
Correct.
So you're not going to build more units per acre in a microhousing structure. You're just going to have a lower parking threshold.
Correct.
If it's in the TOD. And that's where the benefit comes to the developer, is that right?
No. So the way the TOD works is that you have a choice. you either develop under the zoning rules, which have a certain density and a certain parking requirement, maybe certain design standards, or you choose to develop under the TOD in a specific area. And the Planning Commission helped define that area. And if you choose to develop under the TOD, those other rules go away and you have new density limits, substantially higher density limits and lower parking requirements. In exchange for that, you provide affordable housing, and you're doing it in an area where it's presumed that will create a dense enough area to support transit, which we hope will be coming along SR 522. So it's not that your microhousing development in the TOD would look the same. It could if you were developing under the standard zoning rules, but if you were developing a microhousing project under the TOD rules, it would look very different because you could go to a much higher density with less parking.
Could without microhousing.
You could without microhousing.
You could build 600 square foot units in a TOD.
Correct.
And you could build the same number, but if you built microhousing in a TOD, you couldn't build any more than
correct
non-microhousing.
Right.
So there's no incentive to go microhousing because your units are going to sell for less, and you'll have paid the same amount for the land. You just can't put as many units in it. In other words, the ratio is the same.
Right. It probably depends on your land area. How big is your property and how many units can you get on there? You can build a lot more.
You can't put any more microhousing units than you can non-microhousing units.
Well, in terms of density, but in terms of land area, maybe say you couldn't achieve your maximum density.
If you couldn't.
If you couldn't achieve your 150,
right.
and you could build 70
right.
two-bedroom units, but you could build 100 microhousing units, you might choose to do
right.
that if you weren't at your maximum density.
Right. The plot just wasn't big enough.
Correct.
I can see that. But the ratio is the same. So it
Right.
seems like there's tons of incentive for somebody to build TOD.
There are a lot of
unless the cost of
incentives.
the affordable housing offsets all of that or most of it.
Yeah, we hope not.
So, it's like Kenmore's version of the grand bargain, right?
Right.
Seattle grand bargain. So that makes sense. And I'm trying to see where the incentives are for microhousing because we want to create this option. I think there's broad agreement here about that. It's a niche in the housing market. Choices are good, especially in housing, especially at that segment of the market. But I'm not sure we're giving much of a carrot if we put 1.0 for parking, because that's the biggest incentive for a developer to do microhousing instead of conventional. And that 0.6 is only TOD, so everything outside of TOD, which is a pretty small area, is 1.0? 1.2?
Yeah, it ranges from 1.0 to 1.2. It depends on where you're located.
So there's no bonus for that. Is that right? For microhousing as opposed to conventional units.
So in some parts of the city, for a studio unit, it's 1.2 per dwelling unit. And so if you went to 1, there would be an incentive for microhousing. In other areas, downtown commercial and downtown residential, in certain parts of it, the standard is 1.0. And so then there would not be an additional
There's no
incentive.
benefit.
Correct.
Okay. And we're kind of like Deborah said, guessing. You know, we come up, okay, what's a compromise? But there's no data. And my hunch is, well, let's give them an incentive, but let's not create the parking burden. So I'm kind of leaning to where Angela and Deborah were with 1.0, because it gives something. Mike, did you have something? I see you nodding.
Yeah, I guess I just declare myself, in all fairness. In general, my problem I've had with the whole micro-housing discussion is that I'm not really convinced that micro-housing is appropriate for Kenmore. And that's been my struggle all along. Why I like this discussion is because it really turns to, okay, maybe we need to figure out how to do this appropriately and how do we manage this in a way that makes sense for Kenmore. So when I look at the incentives and I think, okay, where does microhousing make sense? I think only within the TODs does it really make sense. And does that really mesh at that point with our strategic thoughts about what we want Kenmore to look like in the future? So I can be okay with the TOD. Where I think, and where the discussion is going, is where I think this goes to, is it creates a significant incentive for developers to consolidate parcels so that they can maximize the density within the TOD. Okay, if you've got the transit orientation nearby, you've got some of the facilities in there, I can get comfortable with that, not necessarily happy with it, but I can be okay with it. Where I tip into not being happy is when you get outside of that district. And at that point there, I think I go into my protection mode and say, how do we protect the rest of Kenmore so it doesn't become overrun by these? And I think the parking piece is probably one of the best tools we have. You're not going to see, I think, a huge expansion of micro-housing outside of the TOD if you keep that parking requirement in there. So that's where my thinking has been going with this. If we're going to do micro-housing, let's do it within the TOD, because at least we have some of that infrastructure there, and we have the potential for it to grow over time, particularly if you concentrate it. But beyond that, I don't think that, particularly sitting here today, that we want to encourage that. That may change in the future as population grows, but today I don't think we want to have that out there as an option. Let's concentrate it within the TOD.
Thanks, Mike. Carol?
I would really support that, and it's because all you have to do is go on the north-south corridors of Seattle and look at what they have the money to do, and that there is incentive for developers to consolidate parcels. We are probably not going to be at that point anytime soon, but we are going to have people living here, and we do have property owners that are going to live adjacent to these developments. So I think we need to address what's at hand as best as we can now. And there'll be an opportunity to change in the future. I mean, if we got some big DOT tunnel going under Lake Washington, and it got finished and we wanted to turn the whole 522 into whatever, I mean, then you have some real facts to work with. But all of that experimental micro-housing that's up and down Roosevelt, up and down Greenwood, it'd be wonderful if we had some statistics on that, because they don't have parking garages. Their residents have to ride the bus. Do they? Well, let's find out. Right now, though, we just need to make some kind of definition available so that if a developer was thinking that way, we can cover our valuable land resource. And, if it's in the DOT zone, we should make that definition really clear what that developer can do. If it's outside of that DOT zone, well, I think we don't necessarily have to incentivize that.
Thank you. The one thing that all makes sense, but the one thing I feel like we might be missing if we don't give some incentive, because there's not much incentive inside the TOD zone when you've got all the benefits of the TOD anyway.
Right.
You're going to make more money with bigger units. You're going to sell for more, and you got the same ratio for density. If you've got a parcel that suits it, the maximum number of units, the developer's financial incentive is to build the traditional units, not micro-housing. They get the parking break, they get the density improvement. The only question is how much affordable housing burden they have to bear. Right. And presumably the council has looked at that carefully enough to know there's still an incentive. So what the incentive, the real incentive lies outside the TOD for micro-housing, and I agree with all these points about parking, and it's probably there's not enough data, and that's where I'm leaning. But the one thing we're missing is here's a chance to work within the market forces. You're not, things work more efficiently when we're working with the flow of supply and demand than against them. And we're losing a chance to encourage builders to create cheaper housing in a desirable place. And that's the benefit you get that might be worth the risk to the parking. And that's where I'm kind of thinking maybe it's worth giving a bit of a break, maybe 1 point, 1 stall per unit, to give some incentive to create that, develop that segment of the housing market.
Isn't that what the...
Go ahead, Deborah.
Sorry, isn't that what's on the table now, the 1.0? I mean, that's what's
That's
written.
what Angela said. I thought.
Well, okay.
But I thought
so
what was on the table is
so
it's 1.0
where,
outside of TOD.
Yeah.
Sorry. So where it is now, it would outside a quarter mile of 522, we would mimic the studio apartment ratios. And there are two ratios, 1.0 and 1.2, depending on what zone you are in. So downtown commercial and downtown residential west of 68th have a lower number. The other zones are at 1.2.
So there would effectively be, if we're mimicking the parking, there would be no incentive for building the micro-housing. Is that, I mean, am I understanding that correctly? There would be no parking incentive.
Correct. If you went with the one, if you just mirror the studio apartment, right, there would be no incentive.
Right. And similarly in the TOD, it's 0.6, so there's no incentive there. Same. I mean, we're mimicking the parking ratios of the underlying zone for this. We're not altering. And the proposal is not to alter, is what you're saying.
The proposal is to alter because within a quarter mile of SR 522, in areas that aren't able to choose the TOD or don't want to choose the TOD, we go to 0.6.
Okay.
Right.
That's where I wasn't clear.
Yeah.
This is so technical. Go ahead, Angela.
Earlier, I didn't say a specific number because I don't know if one is. I do agree with Deborah that it seems that some of the data shows that not as many people have cars, and I'm kind of inclined, I think, to agree with Deborah, which is that we could just split the difference. Like, I feel like 0.75, 3/4 of the units would require parking instead of 0.6, which is just a little over half. That's a pretty significant difference there. I think we don't have enough data because even some of the cases or examples that I can think of micro-housing, all of the ones I'm familiar with are in like really high density transit oriented areas. They're near like University of Washington or, in downtown Redmond, which is very walkable. And I kind of can't imagine that a builder would build in really residential suburban areas that don't have easy access or is very walkable. I think it seems like it wouldn't be as attractive to buyers or renters. But even if they wanted to, I guess I don't share the same concerns as Mike voiced that the ones I've seen, I don't think detracted from the neighborhoods in any way. That was readily visible, at least.
Anybody else? So there's nothing on the table here. A lot of good discussion. There's no motion.
Oh, should we do that?
That's it. I think we're sort of at the point where we're kind of noodling this, and I think there's a desire to keep noodling it because I don't have a number in mind. So I'm not ready to make a motion, but it's sort of, if we're done, then I guess the point, then it would be time. But Deborah, go ahead.
I can make a motion.
Yeah, please.
I mean, we can try it. See where we end up. So what I've been, just 1 second of context. So what I've been hearing is somewhat of that the only area where the existing kind of proposal provides an incentive for microhousing over and above the underlying zoning parking issues is within the quarter mile of 522 that is not TOD. Okay, so because if people go with the TOD, they're going to get that 0.6. So, okay, so given that, I'm still hearing that we don't quite have the downtown Redmond feel, the downtown Kirkland feel in terms of amount of services and amount of transit, and I would totally agree with that. So maybe the 0.5, 0.6 isn't quite for us. However, my motion is that we go to the 0.75, which would be the assumption that 1 out of 4 of those, remember these are only single people because we made that restriction. One of those 4.
I need to just clarify that. You could go up to 2.
If it's over 350.
No,
right?
you can go beyond 2 at 320 square feet or more. So you could have 1 or 2 people in a microhousing apartment.
So
At the 320, you could have 2. Yeah, right.
for each unit.
You can have 2 up to 320. Beyond that, is where you would get into the ability to have 3. So you could have a
Oh, okay.
295 square foot microhousing apartment with 2 people
Oh,
in
you
it.
can. Okay. Okay. I misunderstood that.
Understandably.
Still, let's try it, see where we get.
Yeah.
So given that clarification, the proposal is to go with 0.75. So that would be 1 unit out of 4 units not having a car. Could
So
try that.
My job is to paraphrase the motion.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just want to get it right. So the motion is to adopt microhousing with just in the quarter-mile area near 522? Or is it all
No.
the entire staff proposal?
Right, it's the entire staff proposal, which effectively mirrors the parking standard in all the other areas.
Right. But the benefit you're pointing out, the change is to allow, instead of 0.6, 0.75
Require that.
parking stalls per unit
Within
a
that
quarter
quarter
mile.
mile, exactly.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Yeah,
Question of
go ahead.
clarification.
Yeah.
Does the intent still limit this to areas that are zoned multifamily?
Yeah.
So there's nothing, let's say quarter of a mile is zoned multifamily within a quarter.
It would be any place where an apartment, any apartment, could be allowed.
Thank you.
So I suppose it could be in a commercial area. You could have a mixed-use microhousing project or something like that.
That's what I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of.
Yeah.
that.
Thanks, Mike. Good. All right, so I think we have a second. Angela seconds. All right, motion on the floor. Discussion. Mark.
The point about how
On
many
the table, really. It's not on the floor, but
somewhere.
go ahead, Mark.
The point about
Furnishings. What do I know?
the point about number of occupants per unit is, to me, has some bearing on this. Do we have any facts or figures about, in other microhousing developments, how many are single occupied, how many are double occupied? Do we have any even rough estimates of that? It's just an assumption that the majority will be
Single
occupant.
I will say that in the photographs, in the descriptions, the majority of the ones I've seen talked about are single occupants, but I've also seen some that were, for example, roommate situations. I remember there was one, it was up by Seattle University, and it was 2 roommates who were sharing a microhousing unit. It was like perfect. It was a little bigger than a dorm room, but it was really affordable.
Okay. Thank you.
So if I may, I thought I saw in one of the memos, and I think it was an earlier memo because I was looking at this memo and I didn't see it, but there was some research and data that said that I know you have some car ownership info in here about how few microhousing occupants own a car, 35% in some places.
Right.
And that 0.6 seemed like a safe, was exceeding the data by a certain margin
Right.
to sort of compensate for the unknown. We might get more cars than we thought from the data. Do you know more about the cars per occupants in the most comparable areas?
I don't have the data. Again, I'm trying to achieve as much local data as I can, and the only that I could find was the Kirkland and the Redmond studies, and then Seattle again, which is not, they too noted that there was a lower ratio of people that owned cars, but that's a very different community. So the closest I have are those parking studies in Kirkland and Redmond that showed the reduced car ownership, but I don't have anything else.
It's the best we can do. But and was it 35%? Of the
Right,
microhousing occupants own
it
cars?
Was,
and is that per unit or per occupant?
So the 2013 City of Seattle study was 1/3 of microhousing residents owned or had access. It doesn't clarify to me whether that's single or double. August 2012 travel survey of residents in Redmond microhousing projects showed that 35% drove to work compared with a 76% Redmond average, but that doesn't quite speak to the question of ownership. It
Right.
speaks to how many are driving. Again, acknowledging that there's a lower number that drive. So yeah, so that's what I have. And then the 0.6 parking spaces per unit that was used for the TOD, that actually came from King County, the King County Transit Oriented Development Group, who said that that was typical for higher density transit oriented projects in the region. But again, where are those specifically? I don't have the background data.
Okay. I see a hand. Angela.
I just wanted to comment on that one data point that's in support of millennials not having cars. Like, users of Car2Go and Uber are generally in high density areas because you have to have access to Car2Go, and really for you to have great access to Uber, you want to be in a place where there are a lot of Uber drivers, right? So I do know in downtown Seattle, plenty of millennials use that if they live there, but here on Kenmore, I've used Uber from my house. There aren't as many drivers around here. So I don't know how much that supports our city's position.
I can't resist this opportunity to tell you a really funny story, so please bear with me. But I was
No, wait. We're not bearing with you. I want to encourage this. Please tell your story.
So I was in Oregon over the Thanksgiving weekend. We went to Silver Falls State Park to take a hike. It's out in the country, miles from anywhere, out east from Salem, many, many miles. And we got to the park, and we went on our hike, and we came back, and there was a Car2Go car sitting there. And my husband, who is a member of Car2Go, said, "Wow, it would be so funny if I took this car." Because then the person who drove out there, you can't reserve your car for a long time. Anyway, I guess you had to be there. But he thought maybe we could just move the car so that they would know that we were there. You can take the car. If there's a Car2Go car that's not registered and you belong to Car2Go, you can take the car at any point. It was a joke. I know we wouldn't have done it. But that was country. Yeah. So there was a Car2Go there.
Oh, wow. Wow.
But I think Angela is correct for the most part.
Yeah. Anybody else? Mark.
I'm just going to point out my daughter, who's 22, was home over Thanksgiving, and we were talking about Uber, and she pulled up her phone and at our home, and she said there's an Uber driver like 3 minutes away. So I agree with Angela. It's not as popular as Seattle, but I think it's going to become more popular. Yes. So that, I guess, speaks to there are alternatives to car ownership that will be presumably more popular, even in Kenmore. So
thanks, Mark.
That's my Thanksgiving story.
Thanks, Mark.
Sorry.
I'm going to just throw out here, I'm really wrestling with this, and I'm starting to shift toward Mike here, Vanderline, because I don't think Kenmore's quite ready for this because we don't have the walkability and all the services to encourage people to go without cars. We've already got TOD, we've already got incentives for density, but we don't have the markets and the shops and the entertainment and everything that Kirkland and Redmond and Seattle do, where this makes a lot of sense. It's like the carts before the horse. But I really want to develop this part of the market, the housing market. I really want to give builders incentives to make it more affordable, multifamily more affordable, and this is a great way to do it.
So then we'll be ready for them if we're saying we're ready, market, when you are. Come on down. If you really want it to be market driven, then the market will come when it's ready.
And I would do it in a heartbeat if that's all it was. But the other side of the analysis, what the Prince has pointed out, we're going to have potential parking burdens because people are going to use more. We don't, even the data that you pointed out isn't exactly answering our question. It's per resident, not per unit. It's who drives to work, not who owns the car. So we don't have hard enough data to, I think, take the risk in a city that relies heavily on cars, and we're doing so many things to try and encourage people to get out of them and take buses and Sound Transit 3 and all these other things that we're doing, which are great ideas, and more density. Go ahead, Deborah.
Do we know, maybe others do, I don't, what happens if we decide on something? Let's say we decide on 0.75, and there's spilling all over the street. I mean, is there a mechanism for revisiting the
You can always, well, the council can always change the code if it's truly, but you'd then have to have that sort of cause and effect that it truly was the parking regulations. But yeah, you can always amend the code. It's always an option.
But you wouldn't go back and capture a development that
Yeah.
Well, right,
once they had built their
Grandfather.
parking.
That's true. They're
Right.
That would be a taking. You said,
Right. Oh, yeah, okay.
you lost your parking. That would be, oh, go ahead, Carol, please.
Okay, so this is a funny story too. I have walked around Green Lake since, rode my bike there. I mean, I lived in Seattle all my life. So, and we lived on Green Lake when we first got married. Had an opportunity to buy that house not long ago. Wish I would have. But the funny part was I pulled up to a parking spot I often park for free. You know, you're parking so you can walk around the lake. I hop out of my car and my walking partner goes, "This is a pay spot." And I'm like, "No way." And all the perimeter road, all the way around Green Lake, is pay parking now. Now, there was no one parked up and down that block, but was I going to get a ticket for walking around the Green Lake? I'm not gonna. I paid my whatever to walk. I might take the bus next time. No, I won't. But I have several neighbors who have given up their cars on top of this hill, and they walk everywhere. Even though there's not too much to walk to, they walk a mile down to the bus, hop on the bus and go do everything on the bus, and walk a mile up. Now, often they'll call me, "Hey, I'm at the bottom of the hill. You want to run down and get me?" I'm like, "Sure, whatever." But that trend is real, and I think that whatever we do with this microhousing, what we're really doing is we're becoming a community that is part of the future by having affordable housing. We don't know what else is going to come into this area. Maybe we'll attract some wonderful pieces of Amazon, Google, some other kind of commercial venture, and that affordable housing will already be built, and it'll become attractive to those employers. Just a thought. And really that's our regional trend. As a region, we need to accommodate affordable housing units. Let's do it.
Thanks, Carol. So, Mike, your proposal was microhousing, but only in TOD?
I think we could allow microhousing outside of TOD, but I think what we want to do is create intense incentives to locate and concentrate it within the TOD. And that gives us some time to see how that works. It gives us time to build and concentrate infrastructure in a particular place and not have microhousing begin to proliferate in larger regions. So I think there is value in concentrating this. And let's be real clear, we're talking about low-cost housing. That's what we're incenting here, is to build low-cost housing. In order for low-cost housing to work, you need to have the infrastructure to support it. So in order to have that infrastructure in a reasonable period of time, I think you have to concentrate it. TOD looks to me to be the greatest opportunity to do that. I think that's where we want to have low-cost housing. But I think diluting that by allowing incentives that would allow that to be dispersed in a wider area, I think you may tend to lose the value of that infrastructure and maybe even put yourself in a situation where you can't afford to build the infrastructure that you would be able to build if you were building it for a concentrated area. So that's the way I'm looking at this. I think maybe this is the trend for the future, but I would rather deal with what we have right now, which I think is a pretty substantial commitment. Just doing it in the TOD is a huge commitment.
It is.
And you're going to create opportunities for developers to do all sorts of creative things in there, whether it's consolidating parcels so they can do more stuff. Well, let's let them do it. This is our real estate incubator, is right in here. That's what that TOD was intended for. So let's do it there and not allow this to become too dispersed and we lose that opportunity by losing that concentration.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else? Mike Mulcair.
Yep. So I'm not sure it's good public policy to use the off-street parking regulations to try to solve for either a current or a future perceived on-street parking problem, which is what I think we're trying to do, is find that magic number of the right number of stalls per unit so that we don't have overflow parking issues, because I'm not sure residential parking overflow is the entirety of that problem anyway. I think as Kenmore grows, we're going to have a lot of pressures on our parking situation, and I would rather see us approach that head-on from an on-street parking perspective. And if we're going to create policy around this, to approach it from that, and as we look at regulations on parking stalls per unit, I would rather, as we look at things like studio apartments and microhousing, that be specific to the needs of the development. If we have a problem with on-street parking, let's deal with that head-on and not sideways through off-street parking regulations. That just doesn't feel like good public policy.
Okay, anybody else? We're ready to vote. Oh, go ahead, Angela.
Well, I would agree with that if there weren't obvious cases where there is a lot of excess on-street parking because of apartment complexes. Like, I think there are two examples I can think of right on Juanita Drive where there is a lot of people parking on the streets who live in the apartments because there's not adequate parking there. There wasn't adequate parking provided in the apartment, so they are parking along the street. And that is due, I think, to policy. That was due to the requirement that was in place when those units were built. So I think we have to find that balance.
Okay, anybody else? Now we're ready to vote. Okay, any questions on the motion? Motion is Deborah's to reduce the parking ratio for microhousing in the TOD, within a quarter mile of 522 to 0.75, and otherwise adopt the staff recommendation.
Right,
All right.
which in all other areas
Mirrors the other parking ratio standards, okay? We good? So all in favor say aye. And raise your hand. So
Aye.
Aye. Oh. And this is to Deborah's motion. Okay. And all opposed say nay, because I like Mike's idea better, but he voted for Deborah.
0.75.
Any abstentions? I don't see them. So the motion carries 6-1 to do Deborah's this 0.75 ratio within a quarter mile.
We may regret that decision.
All right.
It'll be great.
They were good. Everything, it was good discussion. All right, so that satisfies that element of the agenda. Anything else? Let's look at the agenda. That satisfies all the items on the agenda. Is there any other comment, new business, or? Yes, please.
Well, I mean, do we have, I think we have to accept, do we need to discuss the broader proposal and accept it, right? I mean.
I think we did.
I think that's what we just did.
I think all we did was revise their proposal according to what you proposed.
Okay. Well, then I'm good with that.
All right. So you guys, did we satisfy the issue on the table?
You did satisfy that, but before you kind of put the gavel down, just a couple of housekeeping matters. We would like to cancel the December 15th meeting. I don't know if the reason why is because we are getting heavily into the telecommunications regulations. And we want to make sure that the commission is kind of brought along with this. And at this point, we're not sure what the members of the commission will be. Council will be making those appointments in December. There are 4 positions up potentially at the end of this year. Mark, Doug, Mike, and Angela. We know that Lisa will be one new member because Angela does not really want to run for another term. She has other commitments. The 3 other members are willing to run if council wishes to appoint them. At this point, I don't know what that mix will be. So we will have at least one member. Could be 3 the same, could be a mix, we don't know. So in light of that, we want to make sure that we bring everybody along at the same time. So we thought that if we didn't have the meeting in December, it would give that opportunity to bring either one or more new members up to speed. So that's the kind of reason for wanting to cancel the meeting on December 15th. So if you're all okay with that, we'll put out a formal cancellation notice.
Any objection? Angela, did you want to say anything?
I just wanted to clarify, it's not that I don't want to.
Well, no, I know that you don't want to.
Yeah, because I've really enjoyed my time on the Planning Commission, but I don't know, I think I've shared with some of you that I started grad school this fall, and I'm just too busy and stretched too thinly. So I think it's probably best that I step down and maybe revisit this in 2 years' time when I finish.
Thanks for telling us. It's a loss to the commission.
Yeah.
You're stepping aside.
Yeah.
You've been a very valuable contributor. Thank you. You're welcome. Any objection to canceling the December 15 commission meeting? No objection. Meeting is canceled by this vote.
Perfect. And then the other item is, given your decision tonight on the micro-housing, the next step would be to present that to council. We were thinking maybe the January 11th council meeting, and we were originally thinking that this was a pretty minor amendment, so maybe we could have whoever is the chair or another member of the commission go to the council meeting and present a recommendation rather than having a full-on joint meeting. So that was sort of the other idea we'd like to throw out there for you to think about.
When would be the first commission meeting in 2016?
January 5th.
Okay, so we can decide then.
So you can decide then. It's just kind of putting it out there that it's we don't usually do that, but
There's no way to do it before Angela's not on our team.
we only have one council
okay.
meeting left, which
Okay.
is December 14th, and that packet goes out this week. So
okay.
unfortunately, we can't.
The one thing that I might mention on January 5th is your first meeting, but the information for the January 11th meeting, if we put it on that agenda, goes out even before the holidays. So there's no need to settle on who, but it would be helpful to know whether you want a joint meeting or you're willing to have a representative go. And then we can phrase it either way in the agenda materials. So it's kind of your decision. Do you want to hold it? Do you all want to participate as a joint meeting, or do you want to just have?
And this is just to present microhousing.
Yes.
Microhousing only.
Right. So the question, and I just seek everybody's input on this, do we want to have just one person speak for the commission before the council on January 11th, or do we want the whole commission to appear with the council at that council meeting?
Well, not knowing what the composition of the commission is going to be on that day, I'd be so presumptuous enough to say I'd be happy to attend, but if we want, I think it would probably be wise to appoint a speaker.
Anybody else? I think it's something that one person could adequately address and answer to the commission, council, on January 11th. So I think that's what we would propose in the materials presented to the council. All right, anything else?
One comment.
okay.
For some of us, this may be our last meeting. So I just want to say, in that case, it's been a pleasure serving with all of you. It's been a long haul. I have asked to come back, so we'll see how that happens. But
That's a good point. This could be the last hurrah for 4 of us, not just one of us.
That's right.
So I echo Mike's comments.
As do I.
Great.
Well, we recognize it was kind of a little awkward position. We know it's the last meeting of the year, and so as a staff, we wanted to kind of say thank you to the commission for your year's work. You can do it. So that whatever the cup and the candy in front of you is just from staff to say, thank you for your participation on the planning commission. We've had a good year with you, and for Angela, who this is your last meeting for the planning commission, certainly as a staff, we've really enjoyed having you on the commission, and hope that your success in your graduate studies and maybe come back serve another term later.
Thank you.
Thank you for this gift. It's very nice.
I just want to acknowledge that we had a docket that was set in January, and every single item that was to be done for this year was done, which is really a testament to your hard work. That was just great. So thank you.
Didn't we actually get a little into 2016 with telecommunications?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Just
So
looking for every little
very impressive.
piece of credit we can get. All right.
We get
Anything else?
2 months off,
What's 2 months off?
August and December.
Yeah, with 2 months off. That's right.
Right.
Amazing.
Yep.
Amazing. All right. Okay, so I have to ask, is there any new business? No new business? Thereby, this meeting is hereby adjourned. Happy holidays.
Yep. Happy holidays.